the most sought after information that affects people, a question, if you would call it that. And that question is life after death. What happens? Where does the person go who physically dies on this plane that we exist in? Is it possible to communicate with a person who has died? And I guess the most significant study we ever made concerning life after death was the one involving the work of Sir William Crookes of 19th century England. I don't know how many of you may have missed that, but I'll just do a brief synopsis on it. But there was a very famous scientist by the name of William Crookes who lived from 1832 to 1919, and that's his picture. He was an eminent scientist who has received all kinds of awards in the field of science. Probably the most respected scientist of his time. But what he did, which was very shocking to the citizenry of that time, was he decided to study that which was very taboo in England, as it is in this country, and that is the paranormal. He decided to look into the reports of mediums and psychics and people who were communicating with the dead, and to do it strictly from a scientific position. Now, what most people in the scientific community expected is that William Crookes would return and support the religious position that all of this was of the devil and that this was against God and it was quackery and fraud, etc. But he didn't. He didn't do that. What he did do was to prove the existence of life beyond what we know as death. And when he published his results, he was set upon by the scientific community as well as religion and the rest. This is what he said. He said, "I am attacked by two very opposite sects, the scientists and the know-nothings." The know-nothings he's referring to were religious people. "Both laugh at me, calling me the frog's dancing master." But this is the sentence that's important. "Yet I know I have discovered one of the greatest forces in nature." The great force that William Crookes was referring to was the invisible force that allows a person who had physically died on this earth to materialize and appear physically in our midst again. This is really bizarre and totally unbelievable, because we're conditioned for it to be bizarre and totally unbelievable. It may be very natural and very normal, but we are conditioned by the system of religion and our societies that this is crazy, this is a fraud, this is wrong, and this, you can't do this, blah, blah, blah. Now, in order to consider William Crookes' work, you have to consider his credibility. You would have to do that yourself. You would have to decide whether William Crookes is a credible person. Because he's finding something in seances, and then he's conducting experiments with mediums, and the religious and the scientific community are both attacking him. So let's look at his credentials. William Crookes was born on the 17th of June, 1832 in London. He studied at the Royal College of Chemistry and became one of the most important scientists of the 19th century, both in the field of physics and in chemistry. He combined private experimental research with business. He also edited several photographic and scientific journals. Having inherited a large fortune from his father, he devoted himself from 1856 entirely to scientific work of various kinds at his private laboratory in London. We'll go on to the next one. In 1861, he discovered the metallic chemical element thallium, This led him indirectly to the invention of the radiometer in 1875. He later developed a vacuum tube, the precursor of the X-ray tube. His studies of cathode rays were fundamental in the development of atomic physics. He was knighted in 1897 and received the Order of Merit in 1910. He was also a Fellow of the Royal Society, becoming its president between 1913 and 1915. William Crookes was one of the most prestigious scientists of his time. His work was the precursor of the X-ray. His work was the precursor of nuclear physics. And here he had been convinced that communicating with those thought to be dead is real. And in fact, he came back with the point that these are people who are absolutely alive. When he was set upon by the scientific community and by the religious community, he made one of the great public statements of all time on the matter. You can take that down. They came to William Crookes and they were really coming against him, the religious people and the scientific community. And the question he was asked was, how can you dare say that it's possible for a dead person to come back to life and appear in human form? And his answer is absolutely classic. William Crookes said, I did not say it was possible. I said it happened. After 30 years of experiments, William Crookes appeared before the English Parliament, and he was in failing health at that time. It was shortly before he died. And it was kind of thought that he might kind of make some kind of apology, because he had been accused of all kinds of things in connections with this work. And in his farewell address to the scientific community and to the political community in Parliament, this is what he said. Okay. All right, why don't we just go down here? Okay. Okay. Okay, we got a problem here, and I'm not exactly sure how we.
It's been doing
Oh,
that.
okay. Let's use that.
Well, I can go to the next one.
Okay, go to the next one then. This is what he said. 30 years have passed since I published an account of experiments tending to show that outside our scientific knowledge there exists a force exercised by intelligence differing from the ordinary intelligence common to mortals. Just where we're going. 30 years from probably the greatest scientist of the 19th century, and he has published accounts of experiments tending to show that outside of our scientific knowledge there exists another force that is an intelligence differing from the ordinary intelligence common to us. And then he made this statement, I have nothing to retract. I adhere to my already published statements. Indeed, I might add much thereto. Sir William Crookes died in London on the 4th of April, 1919. Here is a man, you can take that down. They'll try it again. I mean, you know, what could happen? There you go, it'll come back. Here's a man whose credentials as a renowned scientist are beyond question. There's no question about his credentials, but that makes this story even more bizarre, because how do you put down somebody like this? But the reason he was put down is because he dared to go where others feared to go. He was attacked. Religion has such a tight control over the minds of people, and it was even worse then, that even someone as brilliant as William Crookes cannot be listened to when he says he has proof that people who we think have died are actually very much alive. Now, you would think that this would produce much joy, but instead of listening to a person of the stature of William Crookes, The people instead chose to listen to the robed ones of religion and their power-aligned politicians. And you see what we have lost. Consider all of those who have passed on, who have died, friends that were close to us, family members that were close to us, and they're cut off from us. All we know is they're dead and buried, and we know nothing about the possibilities of seeing them now, of talking with them now, of having them communicate now, is what he found to be the case. But the power of religion and the system is so strong that this can't even be discussed. We've lost the very ones we've loved so much, not because they are gone beyond our ability to communicate with them, but we have lost because we have chosen to live our lives in the fears that religion has placed on our head. Now, how far did William Crookes go in trying to prove the materialization of a woman known as Katie King? He actually took pictures, and what you're about to see are pictures of this person who had died and come back to life. This is Katie King. This is William Crookes standing with her. Now, I would be the first one to have said, this is nuts, some fraud or somebody posing or whatever. Except that this man standing next to her has everything to lose and absolutely nothing to gain by coming out and saying, this is absolutely true. This is a dead person who has materialized in the flesh and become physical among us. Here's another picture of William Crookes with Katie King. And it's, as I said, it seems silly and it seems bizarre, and it is, except for the fact that this man standing there is one of the preeminent minds of the 19th century, England. And can you say he could be fooled? I mean, who could fool? I mean, he did all of these experiments under scientific conditions. Is he part of a fraud? His reputation, and it doesn't leave you room to consider those things. In addition to what you see there, he had a doctor in attendance take her blood pressure. I don't know so much whether it was her blood pressure. I think he took her pulse. Right, he took her pulse. When we talk about life after death, and could appear with you, talk to you, physically, not as some smoke, but physically. Now, there's no proof that we can speak of, even if Sir William Crookes provided pictures. And he had witnesses, such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes. He was in the room when this happened as well. And there was a medical doctor that William Crookes there who took Katie King's pulse. You see, let's get this. Here we have a person who died. They're gone. And in this particular situation, they materialize. And they have a pulse. They have a physical body and a pulse. In other words, provided a physical body that was like the physical body they had here. So when they're crossing over or coming back to communicate, they have that because they're going to dematerialize again. They're not going to stay living here. If you say you communicated with a dead person, you will be criticized, as was Sir William Crookes. And the question would be why? Because the people of this earth have been conditioned by religion that this is wrong. That's all. Nobody knows it's wrong. Nobody has any idea what it's wrong, but you're told by religion, if you do this, you're going to get demons and devils, which don't exist anyhow. But they are consumed in demons and devils and all of this weird stuff, when this is nothing more than natural science that William Crookes testified to. In order to study the existence of the return of those we consider to be dead, we have two sources. And the two sources are religion or spiritualism. You can't go anyplace else but that. You have two sources. And you can put your faith or you can put your trust in either one or both or neither. Religion is going to tell you not to try and communicate with those who have passed over. And they'll warn you of demons and devils and a whole bunch of things meant to put fear into you and to put doubt into you about the subject. But of course, when they're telling you this, these are the same people who told you that Eve had a conversation with a snake and Moses opened the Red Sea and all of the stories in the Bible, and they believe every one of them literally. Walking on water, virgins having babies, floating axe handles, and all this crazy stuff. Talking mules, whatever it is. They believe that's true. But they go berserk when you talk about this. They live on the literal Bible. The other problem with religion and the subject of communicating with the dead is that with religion, they have their set doctrines. And anything outside of that is not considered, even if it's correct. Even if it's true, if it doesn't fit in this particular religious group's doctrines, it can't be considered. They can't even look at it. If there is something in the Quran, for instance, that would throw light on the subject, the Christians could not accept it, and that's vice versa. If there's something in the Bible, then the Muslims cannot accept. So you can't deal with religion. They take mythological studies literally, and they set up doctrines and parameters of what is right and what is wrong, and anything outside of those parameters is evil and demonic, and so, you know, they're off the board. You can't consider that. One other point about religion. Religion is the very reason that someone like Sir William Crookes was castigated for making his statements about the materialization of Katie King. These people who he called know-nothings came against his scientific experiments and raised all kinds of fuss that it was evil, demonic, and then blah, blah, and he was bad, and all this was a fraud, and so forth and so on. You know, let's just think for a minute. Why should it be such a big deal for a mind in a body like we have to communicate with a mind that is not in a body? What's the big deal? It's not. It's not a big deal. But religion has said that is wrong, and they have warped people's minds for hundreds upon hundreds of years to where now people are scared to death of something that is basically quite normal. If it wasn't quite normal, then it couldn't have taken place. It wouldn't have taken place. There's no way that William Crookes, who was a scientist, would have been able to talk to you about this type of a thing if it wasn't a normal thing of nature to do that. You're inside of a body, and you can communicate with people, mind to mind, on the physical plane, and you need a body and brain to do that. But when you're outside of the body, according to religion, you can no longer communicate because you don't have a body. Well, maybe you can't communicate physical to physical, but who says you can't communicate mind to mind? And that's what William Crookes is talking about. And then, of course, you have the materialization of the body because you're talking about a force that we basically know nothing about, although we are starting to learn about it. Now, the other possibility, since religion does not really fit in talking to dead people, is spiritualism. Spiritualism. Religion has done a number on spiritualists and made it appear that they are all nuts, are all trying to exploit people and doing bad things by holding seances and things like that. So they have a bad reputation as far as the mass mind is concerned, and most of their seances and readings and so forth are done in obscure places, and nobody really knows what's going on. You don't ever read anything about it. You see the psychic on television, whatever, who you call a 900 number or something, and that, you know, they make fun of that kind of stuff. But we're not talking about that. So the bad reputation that spiritualists have comes from the teachings of religion, which in reality has taught us nothing but hate, guilt, fear, and violence. Whether it be the religion on this side of the ocean or the religion on the other side of the ocean, there is a tremendous hate and a tremendous need to fight one another. So in order to take part in a very normal activity, which is mind-to-mind communication and the possible materialization which can go with it, you're going to have a complete mind change about spiritualism and totally turn your back on religion. Otherwise, don't go near it, because you won't find anything. And that's not to say that you're not going to run into spiritualists who are frauds and con artists, because you are. But you run into pastors who are frauds and con artists. You run into doctors. You run into lawyers. I mean, we've seen people get arrested all the time for doing things that are unethical and so forth and so on. So you can't come against one group and say, oh, they're all frauds. You know, I mean, how many Catholic priests have been arrested and convicted of coming against children, you know, sexually abusing children? How many of them? Well, I'd certainly say they were frauds, obviously, to do something like that. So you have to open your mind, if you want to the possibilities that Sir William Crookes was discussing, and reject the warnings of religion, which have been proved to be false on so many other issues. If you can do that, and if you'll drop your religious fears, you can go where Sir William Crookes has gone and communicate with those who have gone on. If you say, well, there's nothing wrong with it, it's a normal thing, I'm just getting in touch with somebody, I want to find out if they arrived, had they made out, you know, how they're making out, and so forth and so on. But keep in mind that even talking about it, there are going to be the majority of listeners who will strongly come against you because they've been completely conditioned by the ones of religion who do not know. And they've accepted that conditioning, so they will be against you. The overwhelming majority of people outside will be totally against you, and they'll say, this is wrong, this is evil, this is demonic, and they got this from probably the most untrustworthy corporations in the world, which are religious organizations. Hold a seance. What's wrong with it? There's nothing wrong with it. But the majority of people who are mind controlled by religion will declare you to be in league with demons and all kinds of stuff. If you can put them out of your mind, then you can explore this magnificent world of nature and do so without man-made fear. That does not mean that, as I said, we're going to accept all spiritualists on face value, because some are quacks and some perform tricks. But that's the case with any profession. I would ask you to consider the credentials of Sir William Crookes, and then consider his famous statement. I did not say it was possible. I said it happened. In other words, he can't say how. He can't say in the realm of science that something could be explained maybe to the satisfaction of the scientists grouped around him. All he could say was, it did happen. And I am satisfied, based on my scientific evaluations, that everything was correct and there was no fraud. Now, better stay there for a minute. Better come back. Let me show you a picture of a doctor who was in attendance with Sir William Crookes actually taking the pulse of Katie King. Here's here's Katie King, and here's a doctor taking her pulse. Now, either this is true and this is a person who died and came back and materialized. Oh, that's great, Al. Thank you. Thank you. Or William Crookes is a fraud, this doctor's a fraud, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is a fraud, or they were tricked or whatever, which is not really reasonable. But look at the implications of this. Not only does a person who had died come back from the realm of the dead, but the person comes back from the realm of the dead dressed in clothes and with a beating pulse. Totally normal. It's bizarre. And it happened truly, I mean, being reasonable, it happened when people were a bit less sophisticated than today. But it happened under the direction of an eminent scientist and physicist of that time, Sir William Crookes. He claimed that a person who at one time had lived on this plane that you and I live in died in this plane, left it, and then in this situation returned in a full physical body as we see here. Together, I would think that most of us, especially the religious ones who are more comfortable with politics and missile defense, would find this not only hard to believe but downright nonsense. But keep in mind, this is being done by a great scientist. Now, here you have a situation. Let's look at this from a scientific standpoint. If this is a person who died and left our realm, and then under this experiment was brought back and materialized to William Crookes with a physical body, you would have to think that she was teleported from one dimension, one place, to here. I mean, otherwise, how could she get here? She materializes and then dematerializes. How? How is that possible? Each one of us could say, it's not possible. But then we have to accuse Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sir William Crookes, its doctor, and everybody else of fraud. They can't do that. Let's look at the next Air Force report. This is from USA Today. Air Force report calls for $7.5 million to study psychic teleportation. Star Trek fans may be happy to hear that the Air Force has paid to study psychic teleportation. Think of Katie King and William Crookes. A woman who was dead. Think of your mother or your father or your grandmother or your grandfather or somebody you know who's died. Think of that person under the proper conditions teleporting from where they are to where you are, sitting down in a chair, looking you in the eye and talking to you. That's what happened to William Crookes. And now, NASA, the United States Air Force, is doing it. William Crookes was criticized for his involvement in the spiritual realm connected to science. Here you have the United States Air Force studying psychic teleportation. The word psychic is defined as paranormal, supernatural, spiritual in origin or force. And so today, science, the Air Force, is doing what Sir William Crookes did. What did he say? Remember we looked at it earlier? I have discovered a force, the most powerful force in the universe. And everybody laughed at him. Now here's the Air Force spending $7 million to study a force. And what is it? Psychic teleportation. Studying the invisible realm of the mind, of the spirit, of what intelligence dwells beyond sight. Only Sir William Crookes evidently received a surprise in the form of a visitor. What will we receive? What will you receive? Nothing to be frightened of, only to be overwhelmed in joy and love and reunion. What's wrong with that? Let's look more at this article from the Air Force. In the report, author Eric Davis says, psychic teleportation, moving yourself from location to location through mind powers is quite real and can be controlled. This is the Air Force. You're United States Air Force. This is what they're doing. Once again, here's Katie King. Right? She's in another dimension somewhere. As far as we know, she's in the grave. But she's not really. She's someplace else. Somehow or other, William Crookes got her, and she was teleported from one location to another, and he said he has discovered the greatest force in nature. And here's this Eric Davis from the Air Force saying, psychic teleportation, moving yourself from location to location through mind powers is quite real and can be controlled. The 88-page report also reviews a range of teleportation concepts and experiments. Quantum teleportation, a technique demonstrated in the last decade that shifts the characteristics but not the location of some atomic particles at great distances. I just, without getting too deep into science, want you to look at what the Air Force scientists are saying that so many of us know nothing about. Moving yourself from location to location through mind powers is quite real. Now, is that what William Crookes discovered? And of course, he was called a complete lunatic, but this is 2005. And they're saying, no, it's not a lunatic. This is real. And so William Crookes, working as a scientist and suggesting that he has discovered a force. Perhaps the force he discovered is the force of teleportation. And Katie King is a person who moved from this frequency in physical form to a new frequency in physical form and materialized from that frequency into this. Wouldn't you like? Isn't there someone you would love to meet again? To sit with you and hold your hand? Why should that be bad? Why should that be evil? Why should that be demonic? Physically, with her gown on and a pulse just as physical as we. She was simply on a different frequency. And the distance she may have had to travel to reach this frequency might be measured in inches. Right here, maybe. Maybe Katie King is standing right here. And so, where did she have to move? How much power? What type of technique would cause this teleportation to occur? Why not? And yet, when science and the government are experimenting with it, are people who have lost everybody, who has died and gone away, totally ignorant about this. Teleportation is proven. And the Air Force scientists are now studying psychic teleportation. And obviously, they must consider there's something to it. The whole subatomic realm can be a living, breathing race of beings in another frequency that on normal occasions we cannot see, but on other occasions we can see and visit with. Wouldn't that make things much more reasonable? The Air Force is working with this strange psychic force, and no one utters a word. Do you see here the Air Force working with this force, this psychic force, spending $7 million to experiment with it? And what did William Crook say, just to bring back to your mind again? They're laughing at me, calling me the frog's dancing master. Yet I know I have discovered one of the greatest forces in nature. And the Air Force is saying the same thing right now. A great force is mind teleportation, where a person can move by mind from one location to another. Do you see how all of a sudden that which is bizarre becomes scientifically acceptable and completely natural? That there is a time in the not too distant future when what William Crookes did will be commonplace. But because of religious superstitions, we've been frightened away from it, and from the opportunity of communicating mind to mind with those who were so close to us and have crossed over. Recently, I came upon an article that I found interesting, and the title of the article is what I firmly know to be a fact: The Discovery of People in the Invisible Part of the Universe, from Michael Roll. As you know, 90% of the universe is invisible. We only can see 10% of it. And what he is saying, of course, is that there are people who live in that 90%. People like Katie King. People like somebody in your family who has died. They live there. And yes, it is possible for them to come back and visit here. And yes, it is possible for you to go and visit there. What I liked about this is that it's not talking about ghosts or spooky spirits. It's talking about people. People who used to occupy bodies here in this dimension and no longer do, but who are still people nonetheless. Just like you, when you go to bed and you're dreaming, and you think you're dreaming, but you're involved in all kinds of things somewhere. And you don't have that body. That body of yours is lying on a bed somewhere, out like a light. But you're not out like a light. You're very active. Regular, normal people whom we should be conversing with. People that we know, we've loved. And yet because of the superstitions of religion, we have lost contact with when their bodies fail. If William Crookes had been uplifted and encouraged, how far ahead we would be. We might have reached the point where the Air Force is trying to reach now, of saying exactly what he did and how he did it. You may run to your priest or your minister and declare this as evil rubbish. But I have presented to you the credentials of Sir William Crookes, which are without question. There's another scientist who lives with us today in the year 2005, who recently came to the front to comment on the work of Sir William Crookes. His name is Peter Wadhams. He's a professor of ocean physics, head of the polar ocean physics groups at the University of Cambridge. His first degree was a BA in physics at Churchill College from 1970 to 74 at the Scott Polar Research Institute, University of Cambridge. His PhD was awarded in April 1974 and a fellow at the Institute in Victoria. From 1980 to 81, he was the Office of Naval Research and Chair of Arctic Marine Science. 1988, he received the Cecil and Ida Green Scholar at the Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics. 1995, he was the invited visiting professor at the Arctic Environmental Research Center in Tokyo. 1997, he was a visiting professor at Graduate University of Advanced Studies in Tokyo. 1993, the senior research fellow at Churchill College in Cambridge. 1971, he received the Bronze Medal, Government of Canada. In 1977, he was invited into the Royal Society of Edinburgh In 1983, elected fellow to the Arctic Institute. In 1987, the H.M. Queen Polar Medal. And I'm showing you all of this stuff because Peter Wadham commented on Sir William Crookes. You can take that down. And the fact that in William Crookes' experiments, he claimed that K.D. King had materialized from what we call the realm of death to appear in front of him physically. Now let's look. I gave you all of the credentials of Peter Wadham. He is another prestigious scientist of the University of Cambridge of 2005 of great merit. Let me show you what he said. What Crookes' careful description makes crystal clear is that in his own home and laboratory, under conditions of reasonable lighting, he saw Florence Cook, who was the medium, and K.D. King at the same time, and that they were separate entities. This allows only three explanations. One, he was a liar. Two, he was fooled by an accomplice of Florence Cook posing as K.D. King. Three, he was telling the absolute truth, proving that materializations occur. Let's go to the next one. Given Crookes' stature as a scientist, his demonstrated respect for truth and accuracy in all of his conventional scientific work, and the amount that he had to lose and did lose in terms of his reputation by endorsing materialization with nothing to gain by it, I would say that number one is impossible, and that is that he lied. Number two, that he was fooled is impossible, since these sessions were held in his own home lab and completely under his own control, so no accomplice could have gained access. This leaves us with number three, and Professor Wadham continues as follows. Yes?
That's it.
Yet they couldn't, is that okay, now, all right, that's right. This is what he said. Go back to the one before this. Yeah, I messed that up. Professor Wadham said, I get the feeling that both the established scientific community and the educated general public in his own time were uneasily aware that logically one should believe Crookes. Yet they couldn't bring themselves to do so consciously, since if they did, they would have to acknowledge that here was a phenomenon of mind-boggling importance, exceeding importance all the exciting physics then taking place, and that this should therefore become the chief concern of science. So here's this scientist, Peter Wadham, saying, if what William Crookes said was true, and he says he has to believe that it was true, then it should become the chief concern of science. Peter Wadham goes on to say, it was too much to ask of people to recognize as a serious business things which up to then had been the preserve of spiritualists and other characters believed to be weird or fraudulent. Yet deep down, they could not ridicule Crookes. They could not run him out of town on a rail, because unconsciously they had to acknowledge that he was right. So the result was a strange ambivalence towards Crookes. He continued to be respected for his discoveries in physics. He became president of the Royal Society, but his work with mediums was ignored and not spoken of. Let me pull out a sentence that we should give close attention to. Professor Wadham is commenting on why the general public couldn't speak favorably about William Crookes. They couldn't bring themselves to do so, since if they did, they would have to acknowledge that here was a phenomenon of mind-boggling importance, exceeding in importance all the exciting physics then taking place, and that this should therefore become the chief concern of science. That's what the scientist Peter Wadham, who today is at the University of Cambridge, says. And he goes on to say, this persists to our own time. As a physics student, I learned about Crookes' work with cathode rays and his discovery, you can take that down, of the Crookes dark space and the cathode ray tube. I learned about the Crookes radiometer, which shows the pressure of radiation on the surface. I did not learn about Crookes' work with mediums. Other scientists had it worse. If they were distinguished, now this is what Wadhams is saying, if they were distinguished scientists in another field, which might lead one to expect that their psychic research results would be respected, then not only were their psychic findings ignored, but their solid achievements in other fields were downplayed. So they did not receive the full honor and fame they were due. Professor Wadham here is pointing out that it was not only William Crookes who ran into this problem, other scientists who also found connections with the other side. One example is Sir Oliver Lodge, who sent the first radio message and was probably the rightful inventor of both the thermonic valve and the spark plug. Here's the guy who invented the spark plug, but who received no credit for these things because he was tainted by his psychic interests. Isn't that interesting? Alfred Russel Wallace was the co-discoverer of evolution with Darwin and actually had priority. He was the chief author of that paper. Wallace did much more than Darwin in investigating natural selection, but got much less credit because he dared to be interested in life after death and wrote papers on sittings with mediums and observations of people like Daniel Douglas Home. In our own day, Cambridge University shows little recognition of the achievements of Brian Josephson, despite the fact that after retirement of Tony Ewing, he is the only Nobel laureate in physics currently at work at the university. They had to give him a chair, of course, but they seem embarrassed by his continued existence and his range of research interest, while praising to the skies and making a large money out of the reputation of Stephen Hawking, who is not a Nobel Prize winner. It is a psychological phenomenon, he says. Deep down, they know that great scientists who engage in this kind of work and get positive results should be believed and should cause this subject to become a central theme of the world's scientific effort, communicating with the dead. But they dare not accept this thought. So to square their consciousness and make the dissonance less extreme, they invent reasons to pretend that the great scientist is not actually as great as he seems. That is somehow naive or bonkers, or that his conventional discoveries weren't as important as they first appeared. And Professor Wadham ends his remarks. For truly great scientists, this effort to rewrite history is unfair and an insult to their reputations. But the ones who suffer most are the good, not great scientists, who interest themselves in psychic or life after death research. It's open season on these. Their papers cannot be published in mainstream journals. They get no research funds. They are fired or downgraded from their jobs for no valid reason. You can ridicule Josephson, but you can't take away his chair. You can, however, destroy the career of Robert John, who lost his job as Dean of Engineering at Princeton for daring to get positive results in a long series of experiments on psychokinesis with random number generators. These are the real martyrs to truth. Best wishes, Peter Wadham. So here we have a very prestigious scientist of today talking about the scientists of today and yesterday, both great and not so great, who have suffered at the hands of society and religion for daring to explore the science behind spiritualism, who dare to explore the existence of life after death. This is important. Scientists do not go full blast because the cultures led by religion have so compromised the minds of society. Therefore, we do not communicate with those we know and those we love who are on the other side. There is a science to spiritualism. It is electronic science, and it is mind to mind, whether in body or not. There's nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong, in trying to make contact with a departed loved one. It is religion that is wrong for creating the atmosphere which cuts off the relationship totally. Whether one goes to a psychic or to a medium is up to the person. Of course, one has to be aware of the possibility of fraud and deception. That's part of it. And religion, which has grabbed the minds of the majority of people is a perfect example of fraud and deception. Try to consider the feelings of someone you know who has died recently, a family loved one, a dear friend. In many ways, death can be likened to a journey. If you take a trip to a foreign land, you move away from those whom you love, what would be your first order of business when you arrive at your destination? Most of us would want to call home and let our loved ones know that we arrived safely. Thus it is with death. Spirit, our loved ones, wish to convey to us that they have made the journey and are okay. Mediumship can be a telephone line through which this communication takes place. This is precisely the difference between a medium and a psychic. A psychic can give names and addresses, but only a medium, one who has touched and linked with the spirit, can convey the true essence and love and spirit of that person. And that bears with it the greatest of evidence and comfort to those who are grieving, and there is nothing wrong with that. The Bible briefly confirms the fact that people who have died can materialize on the earth in their physical forms and can be recognized. I'll show you where that. Matthew 17:1, and after 6 days Jesus took Peter, James, and John to a high mountain apart, and he was transfigured before them, and his face did shine, and his raiment was white. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elias talking with him. Now, here are two guys who were dead for a couple of thousand years. They show up and they're having a conversation. They're talking. They were recognized by the others, so they had a physical form. Now, of course, this is mythology, but nonetheless, it does speak of the ability of those who have passed over to return in physical form, engage in a normal conversation, and be recognized. When we think of these kinds of situations, it brings to my mind John Edwards. You want to show the next picture? He's probably the most famous psychic or medium. No, you have to.
Oh, I thought you said to turn it on.
Okay. John Edwards is probably currently the most famous psychic and often appears on the Larry King Show and many other television shows. He's been on television often and claims to communicate with dead relatives of people, and no one has ever been able to prove any kind of fraud on this guy's part. And he's very open about all of this. And you know what's funny? He's difficult for parts of religion to come against because he advocates praying the rosary as a way of fulfilling one spiritually. In fact, he has a new book out which is devoted to the spiritual effects of the praying the rosary. So what are they going to say about it? But there are other Christians who have plenty to say, and I want to show you. Now, I've seen John Edwards on and off, and all I have ever seen him do is bring a word from departed people who have died to friends and relatives to make them feel better, to soothe the breakup, and to make them feel good. That's all he does. Give some soothing words from the departed to allow the people on this side to be satisfied that the departed is okay so they can go on with their lives. A beautiful thing. But this is how a Christian website speaks of John Edwards. In regards to the dead, we are not only warned about calling up the dead, but we are warned that the entity called is not the departed, but a deceiving or demonic spirit. For the spirits of the departed cannot come back. The scriptures remain unshakable. Those who practice these things, whether medium or psychic, he doesn't say scientist, man or woman, regardless of who they may be, are detestable before God. As Christians, we are to seek God and Him alone. You go to the next one. So, my friends, the reason that John Edwards is so dangerous is that he is luring thousands of people into spiritualism. That's thousands of people who are talking with demons, but believed to be the dearly departed. I mean, here's a guy who believes in the existence of demons. And he's coming against John Edwards, who has done nothing but share with people the love and the hope and the joy of people who have gone on. He is simply preying on the emotions of grieving people for the money, and lots of it. After Edwards is through with them, they are left believing in spiritualism, and many are seeking out local spiritualists to continue crossing over. Friend, you have a choice. Believe God's word or believe a lie. John Edwards' word. Regretfully, John Edwards trades on grief. And so this guy is coming forth as a Christian. He's coming forth as a Bible believer, and he throws Bible scriptures around. Incidentally, this comes from a website called Exposing Satan's Power. Why would Satan, whatever, and there is no such thing, but anyhow, for the sake of argument, why would Satan or some evil one want to bring a comforting message to a loved one from a departed? Why bring a comforting message of love and peace and hope and joy? This guy agrees that John Edwards is communicating with some power, but claims that the people who are telling him that they are okay and they send their love and they remember the good times are demons. This is why you can't have anything to do with these people. Whenever religion is faced with a reality that is not in its doctrine, they decide it must be a demon. They throw scripture verses at you, which anyone can do to prove a point. The Bible is filled with scripture verses that sexually depraved and bizarre things, such as two girls getting their father drunk and having sex with him. And there's God's chosen people. These people like this never quote those passages. And violently depraved, such as the description in the book of Numbers of how to kill little boys and girls, but keep the little girls who have not had sex for yourselves. They never find those types of things. So pulling up scriptures is very dangerous in trying to make a point. The point is common sense. There is a person inside a body, and you are allowed to communicate with that person.